Am I on? Welcome back. So let's talk about the types of floods. There's four kind of main types of floods, and they are different. Yes, it's all more water than necessary, but there are different types, different causes. Before we do, let me go ahead and give you the first part of the super secret code. Sorry, I got something in my eye. The first part of the super secret, or no, actually, it's not even the first part anymore. Here's another part of the super secret code. 0. You got me? The number 0. One more time, the number 0. So, the types of floods include flash floods, river floods, storm surges, and urban floods. That sounds cool. Let's start with flash floods, shall we? Hold on. Man, sound's just getting me. All right. Flash floods. Generally caused by heavy and excessive rainfall in a very short period of time, generally less than 6 hours. So typically a flash flood, you get just a bunch of rain real quickly. That's what's going to cause a flash flood. So you get a large volume of water, very fast moving. Again, typically after heavy rains, they kind of rip through riverbeds, any place that's kind of channelized, any place that can just kind of hold and contain water. Riverbeds, streets, canyons, washes, and it just kind of sweeps everything away. They can occur within minutes or a few hours of excessive rainfall, so they can happen very quickly. They're kind of more common in areas with a dry climate, rocky terrain, because water can't infiltrate into the ground very well. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like any type of climate and terrain you may know of? Dry, rocky, right? So around here in the Phoenix area, the soil's real dry, so it's really compact. It's really hard stuff. So when rain falls on it, some of it will soak in, but if you get a bunch of rain all at once, it just doesn't have time to soak in. So it's got to go somewhere, so it's going to go rushing down. Again, rushing down a wash, a river stream, a canyon, a street, whatever it may be. So don't drive into floods. Don't drive into floods. Look, this person is a community college student. Don't be the community college student that drives into a flood, all right? Please don't. They're actually, flash floods are the most dangerous kind of flood because they combine the destructive power of a flood with the incredible speed and unpredictability. Some of these other floods, they can predict coming. It takes a while for them to happen. Flash floods, as mentioned in the previous screen, they can happen in a number of minutes. So, they can really happen with little to no warning. Typically, though, with flash floods, when you're looking at looking at a flood as whether it causes more loss of life or loss of property, all right? Flash floods tend to cause a greater loss of life than property. So flash floods, again, they don't really rush into neighborhoods and destroy houses and buildings. They're kind of typically contained. You kind of drive down into a little ditch, to drive down the street, and you're like, oh, that's not much water there, and then this happens, and then this person happens. So generally greater loss of life than property. So they can be pretty dangerous. Don't drive into areas that are flooded. Even a little bit of water can turn into a lot of water real fast. Like this not so bright gentleman is experiencing. All right, so those are flash floods. Quick moving, happen quickly, deadly. Common in around Phoenix. River floods. Well, you need a river first. So it occurs when water levels rise over the top of riverbanks due to typically excessive rain or even excessive snowmelt. They can also be caused by tropical systems making landfall, again, persistent thunderstorms, so a lot of rain in the same area for an extended period of time, combined again with rainfall and snowmelt. So rivers contain so much water that there's a lot of volume of water that could still be added to it before it floods. So again, river floods, that just don't happen. You can kind of see the level of the river kind of rising and rising and rising over a number of days or even weeks. So you can kind of see this coming, and so it's somewhat predictable. So you can somewhat prepare, but they're very widespread. But it's very common for larger rivers in areas with wetter climates when excessive runoff from long-lasting storms, melting snow causes, again, that slow water level rise over a large area. Because it's kind of a slow creeping rise of water until the river floods, people have time to get out of there, get out of the way. So typically you're going to have more loss of property than life. So houses destroyed, cars destroyed, businesses destroyed, whatever got left behind. But people typically can get out of the way. So, yeah, so here's an example of kind of a river flood and how extensive that can be. All right, what about storm surge? So kind of what it sounds like. It's a surge of water, typically during a storm. So forces generated from severe wind and waves. The storm surge can be extremely dangerous because it's capable of flooding large coastal areas. Living around the coast, within probably the first few miles, by the coast, it's relatively flat typically in areas that experience hurricanes. Think about the Gulf Coast, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, on up. So within the first few miles, sometimes even more, the ground is pretty flat. So you're getting a storm blowing a bunch of wind, pushing a bunch of water onto land. That stuff can go in pretty far. So it has the ability to flood large coastal areas. And it's often the greatest threat to life and property from a hurricane. It's not the wind necessarily, it's not the rain itself, but it's the storm surge that does a lot of the damage and the death as it pertains to a hurricane. Prime example, 2005 Hurricane Katrina. Most of the devastation caused by a surge. At least 1,500 people lost their lives during Katrina. We'll get into specifics later in this unit. Many of those deaths occurred directly or indirectly as a result of that storm surge. I had friends that I met in Arizona. I didn't move here until about 2006 or so, that were evacuated from Louisiana and now called Arizona their home. They were refugees. They were refugees from Louisiana, from within our own country, moved here. So some good friends of mine experienced Hurricane Katrina. From what they say, it was not good. It was not good. So here's a storm surge. So here's the ocean. This is some nice coastal area with like some beaches and such, some benches. But you can see how the wind from the storm just kind of pushes this water up. And hurricanes and storms can last for days. So you're just getting a bunch of this water being pushed onto land. Hence, you can flood large areas. So you get loss of property and loss of life with these. And then you get urban floods. It occurs when urban drainage system, sewer system, drainage system is overwhelmed and water flows onto the streets and nearby structures. It occurs gradually, which provides some people time to, move or figure out a different way to drive. And the water is not super deep, relatively shallow, rarely more than 1 meter deep, which is a little over 3 feet, which is still, for some cars, for most cars, they're not going to make it through that. But again, it's not necessarily flowing water, it's more standing water. It creates no really immediate threat to lives. It may cause economic damage, death to property, damage to property, damage to the roads, to the sidewalks. But here's the nasty part. They may also cause sewage leaks. So if you live in a neighborhood that has one of those kind of parks that's kind of like sunken down, where the after it rains, the water kind of collects in those, that's what those parks are for. They're kind of to catch this urban flood runoff so the streets don't flood, so all the water goes to those little sunken parks, kind of soaks in the ground over there. I know I have a few in my neighborhood. But when there's standing water in there, that's flood water, that's wash from the road, whatever grimes on there, possible sewage in there. So if you or your kids or people in your neighborhood are out playing in that flood water in those kind of little park basins, they're probably playing in poop and pee water. Yep. So please don't do that. Never play in flood water for a couple of reasons. One, if it's moving, it could move you away. But you may be playing in sewage, and that brings up another hazard associated with flooding. That can get you sick, get you disease, or whatever. Never play in flood water. If you do, just know you're swimming in probably poop, pee, chemicals. Yeah, stuff that's not going to be too good for you. So again, with urban floods, coming back off of poop, again, it's typically little open soil that can be used for water storage, because we've covered it up with sidewalks, with houses, with roads. There's not a lot of areas for water to soak in, but again, that's why they have those kind of drainage basin little parks that are lower than maybe where your house is, or where where the streets are, because again, all that water, it gives all that water a place to go. Before we proceed, let me give you another part of the super secret code. It is the number 2. You got me? The number 2. Hey, speaking of sewage, the number 2. So, again, urban floods, you can see the water's not necessarily flowing. Typically, it's just kind of stagnant, sitting there water, just because it has nowhere to drain, so it just kind of piles up. Again, but this is a prime example of what you shouldn't be doing unless absolutely necessary to get somewhere. You should not be playing that. And this person should not be standing in that. No. No. If there's one thing you learn in this class this whole semester, is don't play in flood water. It's probably got some poop and pee in it. Words of wisdom. On that note, let's pause here. When we come back, we'll talk about some facts and some not so fun facts as it pertains to flooding. I'll see you back here in just a minute.